Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 18th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the show is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way we keep it going is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, this week we have the opportunity, and this is another episode where we chatted before the election. So you may hear some prognostication. I actually don't remember. We were probably pretty nervous when we were talking about it and did not yet know the outcome. But I had the opportunity this week to chat with Anu Gupta. He's a human rights lawyer, a scientist, and the founder and CEO of Be More with Anu, a professional development company that trains corporate, nonprofit, and government leaders to advance inclusion and wellness by focusing on breaking bias. And he's got a new book out with the same title. It's called Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From and the Science-Backed Method to Unravel Them. So without any further ado, here he is, Anu Gupta. Well, Anu, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am excited to talk about your new book, Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From and the Science-Backed Method to Unravel Them. And so before we even get into all of these science-backed methods and how you've come to know what you know, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So you are trained as a human rights lawyer, is that correct?
That's right.
And so what does that look like? What does that mean?
So basically, I've gone to school for a very long time. So I've both studied as a human rights lawyer, worked on the field internationally. So I really started my career as a middle school teacher in South Korea. And while I was there, I started a nonprofit that worked in the country of Myanmar, which is an authoritarian country, still is, was definitely back then in 2006, and wanted to work in communities that were deeply deprived of basic sense of freedom and opportunity, and really think outside the box. So I was always really curious about social entrepreneurship and ways to really apply principles of business to create social equity. And that's been kind of what I've done since law school as well. In law school, I turned my focus from international human rights, so working in Asia or Latin America, to begin to really look at the challenges we faced here at home in the US, particularly around racial equity and gender equity and sexual orientation equity and a whole host of other identity-based equities, and really discovering that the root cause of a lot of the disparities we see across the board is bias, this thing we call bias, and kind of took on this path to really understand the nature of bias and how we can break it, how we can transform it and transcend it using science.
Oh, there's so much to get into here. A little bit more on your background. So obviously you have an American accent. Did you grow up here in the States?
So I grew up in India until I was 10, and then my family immigrated to the US. So I've stayed in the US since I was 10.
Gotcha. So when you were living and working in these other communities, they were sort of semi-temporary stays, but home was always the US?
Yes, indeed.
And are you a New Yorker?
I am a New Yorker. We moved to Brooklyn and Queens when we first came here, and this is what I call home ever since. I've lived in different places in the US temporarily, right? Nothing longer than 3 months. Hawaii and LA and New Orleans. But New York is where it's at for me.
And so given your training and given obviously the book that we're going to get into soon, I'm curious what your sort of day-to-day looks like now. Like, what is it you do with all of this knowledge and all of this insight?
Yeah, so it's so fascinating. So basically, I graduated from law school in 2011 and practiced as an attorney for a couple of years. I'm still an attorney. And it was during my practice, I was working for a big think tank, that I began to really see that we have such wonderful policies on the book, particularly pre Black Lives Matter, pre Me Too. Um, and it wasn't that there was anything wrong with these policies around anti harassment or anti discrimination, but it was like the human beings that were executing on those policies that were often making decisions that continue to create disparities and oftentimes aggravate them. So that's where the curiosity around bias came for me. And I was on a trajectory to enter legal academia. So again, that streak of academia was always in me. But in 2014, I had been a legal scholar at NYU Law, in their law and business program, actually, really studying new forms of business entities that could really be designed to respond to the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit. But it was then that I realized that I wanted to pursue this passion around understanding bias and really transforming it. So that's when I started my social enterprise, Be More. So it was 10 years ago. And for the first 5 years, really worked on building the science-backed methodology around breaking bias. And what I've done since then, even during those 5 years, was actually lead a lot of trainings, coursework, build a lot of asynchronous programs, and really understand the nature of why a lot of anti-bias trainings or DEIB trainings or anti-harassment trainings, despite we having spent so much money and resources and time on them, are ineffective. So once we kind of understood that, it's basically because of shame. Shame is an afflictive emotion that prevents behavior change. So oftentimes these trainings are designed with that in mind to make people feel a certain way, which kind of creates a lot of backlash. But also there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a massive information gap. So if we're talking about a workplace or university or a nonprofit, people have different starting points. So oftentimes trainers are given the impossible task of course, bringing everyone up to par around history and sociology and anthropology and human behavior, while also managing people's emotions, right? Because bias ultimately isn't rational. It really lives in our emotional mind and emotional brain. And it's rooted in a lot of our past experiences. So that's where I think for me, I built a training company that provides asynchronous training, self-led programs to really bring people up to par around, various forms of biases, challenges around well-being and burnout. And then we facilitate discussions if companies, organizations want them to really deepen the learning. So that's really my day-to-day, has been my day-to-day for 10 years. We've trained over 300 companies and thousands of professionals. But for me, writing this book really was a wake-up call. I never thought I'd be writing a book, but in 2020, I had the gift of participating in a conversation with Oprah and with Isabel Wilkerson around her book Caste, which I don't know if you've heard of this book.
Yeah, actually, but for those who are listening, give us a little background there.
Yeah. So the book is called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, and it's written by Isabel Wilkerson, who is a really, really accomplished scholar. And basically, her research has demonstrated that a lot of the human hierarchies we see across space and time, like race in America or anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, or the caste system in India, are actually a caste system. So she calls even race and racial bias and the existence of race a caste system that has 8 pillars, and that's how these caste systems, these hierarchies, are really erected across societies. This could also apply to gender. This could apply to religion, ethnicity, you name it. So she really diagnoses the problem of how these human hierarchies are built. And then she spends the last chapter really talking about, well, how do we dismantle caste systems? And that's where she talks about this idea called radical empathy. And, she spends, 10 pages around cultivating radical empathy. And as someone who's had been doing the work for 7-8 years by then, I've been teaching people how to cultivate empathy and mindfulness. These are some of the science-backed tools that help us break bias. So she planted a seed in my mind that, oh, wow, like perhaps I need to write a book about, these tools and how we can train ourselves and our nervous systems and dismantling caste systems, hierarchies, biases, and all the things. But I kind of, put it in the corner of my mind. But 4 months later, on January 6th, 2021, as all of us know what happened in the Capitol. Of course, it changed the nature of our country and our democracy. And I just had, weeks of just sleepless nights. I'd been working on this as a human rights, as someone who's passionate about human rights, as a human rights lawyer as well. I was like, well, everything I've done is really about this. And so many people are being so easily manipulated. And it's like history repeating itself. So it was then that I determined to write a book, to really put everything I've researched and have known and have pieced together and synthesized from various disciplines into one place, that could be understood by even a high school student. So that's where the journey for writing a book started. But day to day, I'm still running my company. And then, of course, I'm talking about the book with wonderful people like you, and going to schools and universities and companies and churches and synagogues to really, spread the message. Meditation centers.
Yeah. Has the book become a tool that you now use when you do these teachings and these seminars? Are they somehow still separate, or is this really sort of an amalgamation of everything that you are teaching?
Yeah, so it's the latter, actually. So these are the things that are already part of my courses and my trainings that exist. But the book goes a lot deeper, just because in the book I have all the time and space to really work with all the concepts. So the book is really, I would say, it's become kind of the encyclopedia of breaking bias, because it's also agnostic to different forms of biases. So for me, I wrote this book for anyone, anywhere in the world. So if you live in Turkey and you're ethnically Armenian, or if you live in Malaysia and you're a non-Muslim, like, you can see how the biases you experience, both as a dominant group or a subordinated group, really affect you, and where that comes from and how to undo it.
And so tell me about some of the kind of academic endeavors, the actual science that you were able not just to sort of excavate by reading the literature, but also engage in personally that sort of shaped the views in the book.
Yeah. So one of the first things I discovered, while working as an attorney, is that there's a misperception out there that bias is something that we're born with. So the more research and excavating I did, the more I realized, particularly this nature of unconscious bias, that all forms of biases are learned. And biases come in two forms. There are conscious biases and there are unconscious biases. Conscious biases are learned false beliefs, that are accepted as truth. Simple conscious biases, men are stronger than women, or, white people are better leaders than people of color. Like, these are just false beliefs, but held, pretty commonly. But then there are also unconscious biases, which are learned habits of thoughts. So these are learned associations between certain concepts and certain human identities. So, like, thinking of a surgeon versus a yoga teacher, whoever the first person comes to mind, right? Those are these associations. And both forms of biases really distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So for me, that's where the journey really began. There's been a lot of research, 30 years of cognitive science that demonstrated that implicit bias in particular is the root cause of all discriminatory behavior across industries, whether it's in housing or healthcare and criminal justice, employment. And part of the challenge was, well, like, how do we, if this is a problem, how do we address it? How do we solve for it? And that's where I really fell into the research around contemplative science, which is, really tools like mindfulness and radical empathy and perspective taking that have been shown to, demonstrate a measurable reduction in conscious and unconscious biases. So that's where kind of this was the hypothesis. So I actually, in 2011, 2012, I reached out to a lot of these scientists. I was like, oh my gosh, you've, tested all these incredible interventions. We need to bring this to people. Like, why haven't you done it? And, I was this like young, innocent, nerdy lawyer, and they were just like, oh yeah, we wrote those papers like 15 years ago. It's in the public domain. If you want to do something with it, go right ahead. So that's where this idea for doing something with these interventions really came to mind for me. But there's also something personal that I haven't shared yet, which is that the reason why I really came to this work of breaking bias is, as a young person, as a young adult, I experienced a lot of bias, particularly after moving to the U.S. I'm a queer immigrant man of color. As a result, particularly growing up in New York after 9/11, really became kind of a target for a lot of Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, of course. And I'd internalized a lot of that and just didn't confront much of it, never sought any sort of mental health, counseling or any of those things until I went to law school, where I was living in a pressure cooker environment where bias was often not recognized. So it was in law school that, right before I started my second year of law school, I found myself on the ledge of my 18th floor window about to jump off. So really experiencing the depths of, suicidality, depression, anxiety. Thankfully, in that moment, instead of jumping forward, I fell backwards into my apartment and thought to reach for a friend who lived quite far away from me, but she happened to be walking on my block that very moment, and she showed up in my apartment. So again, these are like inexplicable things of the universe of how this happened. So she showed up in my apartment, and then we talked all night. And the next morning, I really started my own breaking bias journey, with counseling and other things. And some of the things that I'd been using to really address the biases I had learned about my various identities. So these are false beliefs that I started believing about myself, was a lot of meditation practices. So I'd been going to a lot of meditation retreats, and also, given the analytical person I am, really looking at the research of meditation. And that's where I discovered, some of the tools that have shown to measurably reduce bias, particularly mindfulness and loving kindness or pro-social behaviors. So that's where kind of the curiosity really began. Once I decided that I really wanted to create a framework to break bias, I scoured the literature and found that there were 5 tools that really help do that. What I call PRISM. So PRISM is an acronym for those 5 tools. And the way we practice them really begins at M, and we move our way up to P. So mindfulness, stereotype replacement, individuation, pro-social behaviors, and perspective taking. So these are the 5 tools. And of course, I can describe what each of them are. But the interesting thing that I added to this was using meditation as a vehicle to train people in these 5 tools. I mean, you can use so many different ways of doing it. But for me, meditation had been so helpful for me, in terms of coping with depression and anxiety and self-loathing and a whole host of other challenges. And also meditation has been shown to be incredibly helpful in reducing depression or stress or a whole host of other, positive results. So I was like, well, can this also help with breaking bias? And that's what we applied to the National Science Foundation, State Health Foundation, a bunch of other, really competitive grants to study. And we're able to show, through focus groups, through testing of the PRISM methodology, that yes, it creates a measurable reduction in bias. And that's how we came to be training a lot of people in these tools.
Oh, it's very cool. And I think before we dive into Prism itself, I want to go back to that sort of like, fateful day. And I'm curious, was it for you its own sort of bias that I don't want to say that you had been resistant to, because maybe you weren't even exposed to, but that you hadn't engaged yet in any sort of mental health treatment up until, you were a young adult, really?
Yeah. So, it's really contextual, right? So, I grew up in an immigrant family, and we just didn't talk about bias. As we came to the US, we were incredibly grateful to be here. I was raised in that very prototypical immigrant family where we just had to be grateful for this opportunity to be in this country and just do our best and do what's expected of us, which is do well professionally, academically. So in my household, there was very like scarce discussion around our experiences as immigrants, as brown people in the external world. This is like the 90s and the early 2000s, right? Um, but then also mental health wasn't something that was openly discussed, right? For me, I grew up with the taboo that, people that go to see a therapist are like severely psychologically ill. And of course, that's a false taboo, but that's just where our culture was in the 2000s and 1990s until I found myself on the ledge of, my 18-floor window. And I'm like, oh no, I need all the help I can get. So that's where, and then a lot of the biases that I had believed about myself, anything from feeling like I'm wrong or, how I feel inside as a queer person is wrong was something, conditioned by my external environment. So that's where, when I started uncovering the nature of bias, I uncovered that there are 5 causes to how biases are learned, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And I began to see and really make those connections that, oh, I learned these biases about myself and about my identities. I learned how to judge myself or shame myself or, loathe aspects of my identity. And this is where the prism tools really helped me to, you know, begin to really dismantle and disintegrate these false beliefs within myself. And that's what I really share in the book. Like, we have such a beautiful opportunity to really unleash our own potential in our relationship with ourselves and one another when we break bias. And that journey is what I'm sharing with, others.
Yeah. Let's get into that a little bit because I think it's probably important to sit with some sort of operational definition so that we know that we're all talking about the same things. So I guess a sort of obvious question from the top is, what is the difference between a bias and, let's say, a stereotype or a prejudice?
Yeah. So I would say stereotypes are the generalizations that we make about entire groups of people, right? These are just false stories. Bias is the result of stereotypes. It distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So this is what's happening in a clinical encounter between a doctor or a nurse and a patient, particularly a patient of color when, you know, low doses of pain medication are prescribed to darker skinned patients or a whole host of other things. So what's happening in an encounter between a police officer and a civilian, particularly civilians of color or civilians who are houseless or who are poor. What's going on in the minds of those human beings, right? Police officers versus those civilians, how their nervous systems are reacting. So that's where, and that's, it's complex. It's not just unconscious or unconscious bias. It's a mix of both, right? Because we've learned these stories, these stereotypes about ourselves and one another based purely on our being. The fact that I have certain body parts, the fact I have a certain skin color, or, come from a certain ethnic background. We've learned these are the stereotypes, these false narratives. And bias and prejudice are, I would say, I use them interchangeably. And prejudice is kind of the initial like scholarly word when prejudice studies really began as a discipline in the 1950s. And more recently, because of just a lot of cognitive science, bias has been more of a neutral word to use versus like racism or sexism.
And so, there are obviously a lot of different types of like cognitive biases. For example, we're talking about bias as it kind of affects us or as it plays out with regard to individuals, intersectional individuals and the different components of those intersectional, I guess, categories that we may have bias towards. But of course, the reason, not the only reason, but a reason it perpetuates is because of a very central bias, which is confirmation bias, right? That we tend to remember the times when that bias holds true and amplify those examples and make them into a template or a heuristic and sort of ignore or gloss over the times when we see alternatives to that bias.
Exactly. And this is where the PRISM toolkit really helps. And also, thank you for that nuanced distinction. Like when we're talking about bias in the book, It's really not all cognitive biases, but really biases that manifest between human beings, right? And within human beings about themselves, but not the way how our brain is designed. For example, confirmation bias or negativity bias and other things.
Although those things probably do contribute to our biases, yeah, that we hold with others. And so let's talk about the, I guess it's an acronym, not an initialism, PRISM. Um,
Yeah.
let's talk about PRISM. And you said you tend to work through it backward, right?
Yeah, from M to P. And I almost wonder that would it be helpful if before we talked about the solution, if we talked about the 5 causes of bias, like how do we learn these biases, right? So people are often curious. It's like, well, okay, this exists, but actually it has a certain history, right? It has a certain background. So there are 5 causes to any kind of bias, between humans and within humans. And it starts with a false story, a story about our humanity, a story about our hierarchy. So, and I go into in depth where these stories come from, how they originated. And oftentimes they're fabricated, right? Whether it's a racial hierarchy or a gender hierarchy. But so many people don't know the origins of these stories. And that's really important. This is where the information gap is. And oftentimes there's a lot of misinformation. You'd be surprised, Kara, how many doctors and lawyers and teachers I've trained, most of whom are very well intentioned and good intention, who believe that there's a genetic difference between black and black and brown and white people. Like, and this is the massive information gap that we have to bridge. So that false story is really the foundational cause. And then the second cause is really policies. So policies that are informed by that false story. So in the United States, for example, the false story of race really informed who got to be a citizen and who didn't, who got to vote and who didn't, who was placed in under-resourced communities, entire groups of human beings. So that kind of builds the social container. And then each of our brains are trained in bias, through the remaining 3 causes, which is, also known as culture, but it's really made up of social contact, education, and media. So it's perpetuating those same stories. And that's how our brains are being wired. So neurons that fire together wire together. So that's how we're trained to see ourselves and one another.
Yeah, yeah, it's almost this misunderstanding, this calculation that I see very often in my work in psychology, and specifically kind of social justice oriented psychology. This idea, and okay, like, I'm going to take a step back here, but I'm somebody who's very existentially oriented, and one of the fundamental kind of tenets of more like non-theistic existentialism is this idea that existence precedes essence and not the other way around, that there is no fundamental human nature, that instead we develop certain biases. That's a great example. Behaviors, based on what we are exposed to, based on our culture, based on, these are most of the things that we can say are essentialist or that people claim are fundamental to humanity, whether it be, let's say, in group, out group status, whether it be monogamy, whether it be religion, that they're learned. We learned to be this way. And we then superimpose that and try to say that that's just how we would be if we evolved 10 different times.
And that's for me, it's a very similar approach. And I use, so I had to, particularly as I wanted to write a chapter on gender, I really had to blow up time and space. Because unlike race, which is a very recent construct, within modernity, gender has existed in so many different forms and ways across cultures. But what's happened in the last couple of years is that there's a dominance of the binary gender that has been globalized due to colonization and, the remaining 5 causes of bias. And I had to really be like, well, is this how it's always been? And the more research I did, I discovered that, there's a really beautiful indigenous story, between a grandfather and his grandchild. And he's teaching his grandchild that, there are 2 wolves always operating within us. One wolf always gravitates towards competition and selfishness and hatred and violence. And the other is one that's rooted in love and compassion and understanding and healing. And the grandchild is like, well, which one is going to win? It's the one we feed, right? That's the answer that he gives. And that's what I began to see as the nature of consciousness, right? There is an exclusion consciousness that has pervaded societies across the board, and there's an inclusion consciousness that has existed simultaneously. What I call the exclusion consciousness is this idea called wetiko. This is a term that I learned from various scholars, indigenous scholars in particular, because it's actually an Algonquin word that was used by indigenous people in the US when they first came into contact with Europeans who were coming here. And they said that, these humans have a mind disease known as wetiko. They're incredibly self-involved. They're incredibly selfish. And they're almost like they just want to devour and take and take and take. And that was the way their cosmology really perceived that way of being. And that's, in the Christian traditions, is in my understanding of it, is really what Satan or the devil is about. Or in the Buddhist tradition is what's known as Mara, or in the Vedic traditions as Maya. So that's where, we get lost in those unwholesome states of mind. And then there's the inclusion consciousness, which is often known as Ubuntu or interbeing, right, by Thich Nhat Hanh. And that's really about cultivation of all the wholesome and skillful ways of being. And when we look at history, like when I was able to look at history, across time and space, I'm like, oh, wow, like these two forms of, consciousness have coexisted. And it's always been up to humans like you and I to really feed a certain way of being. And that's kind of the invitation that I'm making in the book. And that's what Prism really helps us do, to kind of really feed that inclusion consciousness, particularly around the way we see ourselves and one another, at a time of high polarization and division and so many forms of hatred that are percolating in our world.
And so that sort of relates to, I guess, intersectionality through so many different manifestations, whether we're talking about race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender identity or any of these things, that the sort of I guess the angry wolf, the aggressive wolf, the hatred wolf is screaming for strong division, strong identity, and a lack of nuance and a lack of in between and a lack of acceptance of anything other than, I don't know, maybe not a binary, but a very black and white view of the world.
Exactly. And it wants to dominate, it wants to win, right? It's obvious, in the Buddhist cosmology, it's this term known as the hungry ghost. It's never satisfied, it always wants more and more and more. And that's kind of a tendency that we can all feed within our own humanity. And but with that said, when I think about the last 100 years, we have seen such huge transformations around the world, with respect to gender equality, queer rights, of course, racial justice and racial equity. So there's been a lot of transformation that's taken place, and yet we have so much further to go. And so for me, it's like when I look at that, it's like we're actually operating in a paradigm of inclusion, because never before in recorded human history, or at least in modernity since the 1500s, has there been such ways of being with other humans and treating them on an equal playing field. And yet, I think the battle that we're seeing and that are being surfaced both in our society and around the world is the repercussions of the many, many causes and conditions, the lies that have yet to be dismantled. Particularly, with a lot of the bigotry, political bigotry that we've witnessed in our election cycle this past year. And that needs to be it needs to be, for lack of a better word, it needs to be buried once and for all, these lies that we have become so accustomed to.
Do you think that, I often think about MLK and this idea that the moral arc of history does bend towards justice. And like you said, we're living in an era of the like more inclusivity than we've seen in at least kind of Western modern history. But do you see that this I mean, we're talking about this. For those who are listening to the show, this is airing after we know the outcome of the election. So we are in the dark, the two of us, because we're recording this literally like 6 days prior to election night. But do you think that these views that are deeply bigoted and deeply divisive are a direct backlash to the progress that's been made?
Yes and no, right? Part of it is like, because there's so many factors. There are trillions and trillions of factors that are at play. And it's hard to pin down if any one factor is responsible for it. But I do feel that there is a shift. There's a consciousness shift that's taking place, and these bigoted views have always been with us, right? This is what I experienced in the 1990s and the 2000s when I was growing up, but they weren't out in the open. So part of me feels like, oh, they need to be out in the open so they can finally be, um, they can finally be put to rest once and for all. And that's what the opportunity is for us. Like, we need to end um, the falsehoods upon which white supremacy is built upon. We have to end the falsehoods upon which patriarchy is built upon or heteronormativity is built upon. These are stories that are percolating in the collective consciousness, and they need to be put to rest now. And that's what the opportunity this is bringing for me. And of course, it's really up to each one of us to take that opportunity and move in that direction. And to your point around what Dr. King said, I truly believe that. I mean, one of the quotes that has motivated me my entire career has been, our goal is to build a beloved community, and this will require qualitative changes in our souls and quantitative changes in our lives. And I really feel that making these qualitative and quantitative changes is what breaking bias is about. It's about liberating ourselves from these falsehoods, these ideas. We generally live in ideas of ourselves and one another, as opposed to really living in the presence of ourselves and one another. And that's kind of the invitation that's, the Prism Toolkit makes. And I'm also seeing that all across society, in the last several decades, just the rise of reliance on Eastern spiritual practices, of course, using science and neuroscience to make them accessible and secular. But, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, a whole host of other plant medicine more recently. These are ancient technologies that have been present, but because they were practiced by Black and brown people, and from dominant culture, they were perceived as heathen and savage until neuroscientists were able to study the brain scans of humans that were engaged in these practices and saw such transformative difference in their quality of life and their way of being. So that kind of helped relieve the Western mind around the usefulness of these practices. But the practices are still the same, right?
Yeah. And so when we look at this Prism tool, and to be clear, this is a construct insofar as most things are constructs. This is an operationalism of all of the research that you've studied. It's not the only way, but it is a useful
It is a way.
toolkit.
Exactly.
Yes. And so when you look at how you have operationalized this, help us understand kind of in simple language, I guess, the structure and function of it.
Absolutely. So it's a somatically informed toolkit. So we really start with mindfulness. So mindfulness of our own minds, our own emotions, our somatic experience, which basically means our body sensations. So when a stereotype arises in our mind, I'm with Kara, and I may have certain ideas of what Kara looks like by the way she sounds, or she's a podcaster, she's a scientist, whatever. I just notice them. I become mindful of them. And also, but not just the ideas that are arising, I also become mindful of the emotions, the feelings, the body sensations that accompany them. So that's where we're beginning to create a gap between stereotypes and our decision making, right? So if we think about bias as something that distorts how we make decisions. So that's kind of the first step. The second step is really stereotype replacement, which is when we notice the stereotypes, and stereotypes are generally negative, we replace them with a positive counterexample. So we're weakening the hold of that stereotype.
So kind of exercising the principle of charity here and coming up with an equal and opposite, or maybe even sometimes extremely charitable version.
Absolutely. Create new mental models. It's all about building new mental models. And this is really important, right? Particularly for a lot of subordinated people, right? Trans people, women who wear hijabs, anyone who's deeply, deeply stereotyped. When you think of a surgeon, can you think of a trans person? Can you think of a woman with a hijab, right? So those are the types of ways we're beginning to humanize one another. Then we move to individuation, which is really about dissociating group-based stereotypes or associations from the individual. So if I'm with Kara, I'm really with Kara, the unique individual human that she is, versus my ideas of who she ought to be. If I'm with Adam or Stephen, whomever, right? It's being with that individual, and that takes a lot of curiosity and interest. And as stereotypes arise, we also investigate where they may have come from with a sense of curiosity, not shame. And if shame arises, we notice that too, right, with curiosity. So we don't suppress anything, but we really kind of follow that line of curiosity. And then we move to heart practices. So R is for pro-social behaviors, the second letter in pro-social. And it's basically a whole host of tools like radical empathy, compassion, joy, generosity, gratitude. These are, mental and emotional states that are wholesome. And what they really do is, first of all, a lot of scientists have demonstrated that these skills can actually be cultivated, these tools, through
Yeah, I love that
practice.
you mentioned that because I think it's one of the biggest myths that I try to bust in psychotherapy is like you're not born with a certain amount of empathy, and some people aren't just naturally more empathetic than others. You have to
I agree.
practice
I
empathy.
agree. I agree. And for me, loving kindness is one of those practices that I practice for myself every day, 20 minutes a day, twice a day, for 2 years straight, until it became a habit. And it, from a neurological perspective, what it does is it shifts the underlying negative affect that's associated with stereotypes. So for me, it was a lot of the stereotypes I believed about myself, a lot of the self-loathing, and it shifts that affect. So it's beyond just the mind. This is where it's integrating that with the emotional mind. And that's why it's so powerful. It's really an antidote to fear of self, fear of others, fear of these ideas. And it begins to really dismantle them. And then we move to perspective taking, which is kind of a radical exercise of imagination, imagining being in the shoes of other people. This is what a lot of creative agencies do when they empathize with their consumers, customers, users, what have you, in building products or services. This is what great actors do, right? When they're, portraying the lifestyle or story of another human. And this is something we're all capable of, to really, imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of another being. And this is what kind of builds that intimacy. And the beautiful thing about perspective taking is we could also practice this for ourselves. So for me, for example, I practice this for the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 22-year-old that I once was. And that really helped me then, not who I wish he was, but who he actually was. And that helped me build that empathy, that compassion for this being that I was, but also then to begin to diminish the self-loathing or depression or anxiety that I was experiencing, which is often what people experience because of racial trauma or gender trauma, other things.
Absolutely. Even the self that you are in this very moment, right? This concept, and obviously these are all like psychological practices of being, offering to your younger self what you may have needed at that time. But even in the moment, one of the things that I find that many patients that I work with struggle with, and obviously I do as well, I'm a human being, is how can I soothe myself? How can I offer myself the kindness and the compassion that I need in this moment? I shouldn't say instead of, but so that I'm not so deeply disappointed that I'm not getting it from an external source.
Right.
Because that's such a common frustration is I have a need and that need is not being fulfilled. Therefore, I am left unfulfilled as opposed to, well, how can I fulfill that need?
Exactly. And that is basically when we begin to live fully in our own agency and within our own power. And, bias manifests in four dimensions. There's internalized bias, also known as intrapersonal bias, interpersonal bias, and then institutional and systemic bias. But for me, like the internalized piece of it is really important because unless we can kind of overcome a lot of the limiting beliefs we believe about ourselves, it's difficult to have compassion for others, empathy for others, understanding for others. So that's where I really begin. And what this process of practicing Prism does is it takes us out of that pendulum of victimization and entitlement, which are kind of the two big ways internalized bias shows up. And it allows us to really kind of come to the center and really take ownership and agency over our own lives, but also accept that things are the way they are, the trillions of causes and conditions out there, and not be taken, kind of swept off by them. And that's really important at a time like this, right? So I know what I can control. I can control my vote. I can control who I talk to. I can control what I say to them and control how I respond to them. And imagine if everyone was operating from that place.
But those things have to occur, those two factors have to occur in a balance because when they're out of balance, that's when you get the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, manifest destiny, level playing field, and it's just a function of will and grit. Obviously, that's not what you're saying when you talk about sort of volition and being in your own power.
Not at all, not at all. It's really about transforming that and operating from that place and seeing things for what they are, right? But oftentimes, this is what was really difficult for me. One of my first meditation retreats that I went on, I was sitting with a teacher who is indigenous. She's a Native American woman, comes from a long history of all sorts of historical injustices and historical traumas and ancestral traumas. And I was like a gung ho, racial justice lawyer and kind of speaking about all of the inequities that shouldn't be. And she basically looked at me. Her name is Dr. Bonnie Duran. She looked at me and she was like, Anu, you're just shooting reality. And if you continue to shoot reality for what it is, as opposed to accepting it, you're just going to suffer more and more. And then you won't be an effective, agent for change. And for me to kind of sit there, listen to this, Native American elder share this with me, I was like, oh my gosh, there's just so much wisdom there, right? Um, and that's when I kind of really woke up that, oh, well, we have to kind of practice, or at least I have to practice skillful means around some of these challenges in our world.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me quite a bit, and it's funny coming from an atheist, but it's something I use all the time in my psychology work is the serenity prayer. Really grappling with where we can find empowerment and volition and actually affect change because we are in a privileged position to do it, where we have zero control because we are in a vulnerable position. And how do I know the difference between the two and stop attempting to get blood from empty stones and then sitting with, what we often will call learned helplessness in places where we can affect change?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It's a hard thing to learn, and I think the meta question that I have to I can't help but see a parallel here, and maybe this takes us to another plane in this conversation, is this idea of you're sitting in the shoulds instead of accepting what is. This this work that you do, this life's work, which is so incredibly important, it requires a certain amount of buy-in. And for those who are interested in cultivating these, practices and softening their experiences in the world and opening up their empathy, uh, these methods are probably incredibly potent. but there are always going to be people who don't want to do that. There are going to be people who look at what you do and they say, I want to make this illegal. I don't think this should be taught in schools or at corporations because I think that critical race theory is racist, right? And so, how do you function in a world where you're talking about cultivating radical empathy when there are people who literally see that and say, I want to do the opposite and you will never convince me otherwise?
Such a beautiful question, Kara. And, as you were sharing that, I want to invoke my professor, Professor Derek Bell, who coined critical race theory, who was one of the most gentle and soft-spoken and kind humans I've ever met in my life.
This doesn't surprise me. It is definitely not what people say it is, right?
Exactly. And what he really taught me is that this is where we kind of, because he too was an agnostic atheist person, but he also loved gospel music. And he would just almost, every year we still have a Derek Bell's lecture at NYU Law, and there's a gospel choir that comes down from Harlem and sings, in his honor. And we have confidence, we have trust that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And we have evidence of that. Part of it is like, yes, the exclusion consciousness, the wetiko that's powering a lot of the division and polarization will continue to exist. And, inclusion consciousness has always existed. There's a poem I write in the book from Saint Catherine of Siena. She was a nun in the 12th century of Italy. The status of women and humans in general who weren't part of the top class wasn't very good. But she was carrying this light of inclusion consciousness back then, as a woman, living in that time. And so many have done that. So for me, this work is really, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people that think this is hokey pokey, but I think this is where the science is shifting the conversation quite a bit. People are beginning to see their own self-interest because ultimately they feel sick, from all the hatred themselves. And for me, I also take a lot of comfort from Malcolm Gladwell's work around the tipping point. So we're kind of at a stage where actually we're past the early adopter phase, but we're really moving in this phase of building critical mass around this consciousness shift. And what I see is that it's really going to be in the next 10 years where we'll converge a lot of these social change movements that have been quite splintered, whether it's climate justice or women's rights or immigration justice or racial equity, you name it, right? We're kind of housing justice, all sorts of things. We're all demanding the same thing, but we're operating in our silos. So what I see is that
changing.
It's changing, right?
It's like you saw it during BLM and Me Too, and people marching side by side.
Exactly. It's like you said, it's changing, right? So I think we're in this moment of creating a critical mass and we're moving towards the tipping point. And in that moment, what we're talking about right now is going to be the dominant paradigm. And then there'll be other challenges that we'll have to confront. But we'll move past these bogus stories about our humanity, and then kind of address whatever the challenges of that time would be.
And I so appreciate the point that you just made, which I think bears repeating, that through all of human history, there have always been those who practiced and who cultivated and who reinforced this inclusion principle. And that even though very often history is, right, like written by the victors or written by those in power, and very often when we think about a zeitgeist, we paint it with quite a stereotyped brush. I struggle when I hear somebody say, oh, it was different back then, or this person's just a product of their time, or of course I know that sounds really racist or it sounds whatever, but that was the norm back then. And it's like, no, not everybody was racist even back then. Like, I'm sorry.
They were abolitionists. They were John Browns. They were people that loved across the color line. They were people, so absolutely.
There have always been people on this side of the conversation, and there have been different times when their voices were quieted and different times when their voices were allowed to ring out. But just because it was normative culturally to use certain words or to literally own people doesn't mean that it's ever been moral, and it doesn't mean that there weren't so many people fighting against it.
Exactly. Can I read this poem, actually?
Yes, please. I'm glad you found it.
Yeah. It's on page 48 for anyone who wants to read along. All has been consecrated. The creatures in the forest know this. The earth does. The seas do. The clouds know, as does the heart full of love. Strange, a priest would rob us of this knowledge and then empower himself with the ability to make holy what already was. St. Catherine of Siena, 1347.
Wow, gosh, how heretical to say that in an era too. I mean, it would be heretical even now to say. I love it so much because it's like they don't own this.
Yeah.
They don't own this, and they cannot use this against you. You already have it in you, whether you're a believer or not, right? I'm a non-believer, and that still speaks to me.
Except you believe in hope. You believe in
exactly.
love. You believe, so that's what we believe in, right?
Yeah, I believe in life. Yeah.
I believe in life, exactly. So that's what kind of keeps us going, that spark.
Ugh, I love it. Oh, well, gosh, this, not always when I do the show do I get to say that at the very end of the hour that I spend with my guests that I feel, incredibly motivated, incredibly empowered, and incredibly hopeful. I think part of that is your messaging. Part of that is just like the sound of your voice. I do hope that you record meditations because
I do, yes.
Okay, yes, because you were built for it, or you learned it, but either way.
Yes.
But yeah, very often when we talk about the problems that we're facing in the world, we're very good at diagramming the problems. We're not great at offering equal and opposite solutions, or at least methods for mitigation or for how to move forward. And so I'm just so grateful for the work that you do, for you sharing this with us, and sort of leaving us on this. The show airs on Monday, so I'll say on this lovely Monday with magnified hope.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a gift to talk to you. We were able to go so much deeper than I've gone in many conversations before, and that all credit goes to you for creating that lovely container.
Oh, stop, but also go on. I'm glad to hear it. No, really, I think this was a great fit for the show, and I'm super grateful for all of the work that you do. Everybody, the book is Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From, and the Science-Backed Method to Unravel Them, by Anu Gupta. Anu, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Kara.
And thank you to everybody listening for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.